Hello and welcome to Falling Walls Breakthrough Conversations. We have created a safe and quiet space for interaction with global leaders, outstanding scientists, engaging innovators, and science entrepreneurs. We'll be focusing on their individual research, career paths, and their experiences. The digital audience is encouraged to participate in a dialogue-oriented online meeting and engage in discussions with the guests online. I am science journalist and communicator Adam Levy, and I will be conducting the first interview for today. Here at Falling Walls Breakthrough Conversations, you have a chance to communicate directly with our interviewees. In order to do so, please just use the raising your hand function within Zoom. You will then be spotlighted, and then at the appropriate time, unmuted. You can then ask your question. After your question, you'll be muted again. So if you have a follow-up question, just raise your hand again and we'll go through the whole process one more time. If you have any technical questions at all, you don't need to raise your hand. You can just leave them in the comments in the chat, and one of our team members will be able to support you. We would like to give as many viewers as possible time to ask questions, so please keep your questions brief. This conversation is being recorded and will be available in the content library at the Falling Walls website after the summit. Now, I am joined by not one, but two interviewees to start the day. I'm joined by Markus Rex of the Alfred Wegener Institute and the University of Potsdam, and Stefanie Arndt, who is also of the Alfred Wegener Institute. Now, Markus and Stefanie, you are here because of a breakthrough expedition to the Arctic. Now, perhaps Stefanie, to start off with, could you tell us what was, I suppose, unique about this expedition?
I think the big breakthrough of this expedition was that we were able to go to the Arctic for a full year, to drift through the Arctic in the middle of winter, where we in normal case would have been not the possibility to go there, to study, to understand all the processes that are happening. And this entire project was not only about the atmosphere or the ice or the ocean, but the big strength of that expedition was really the interdisciplinarity, to study the interactions of all these different components of the Arctic climate system, and this was really a huge breakthrough we could make happen.
Now, Markus, Stefanie already touched on this, but perhaps you could expand. Why would you want to go for a full year? Why not maybe do a couple of 6-month expeditions and piece them together?
Yeah, good morning, Adam. It's so important to understand the climate processes in the central Arctic better. So far, we were always kept out of that region because our wall that we had to break is that ice up there. In winter, it is so thick that we can't break it, even with our best research icebreakers. So we were always locked out of that region. At the same time, it's a region of our planet where global warming is fastest. It's really dramatic there. It's 3 times faster than in the rest of the world. And we were never able to really study the climate processes. And therefore, we have a fairly limited understanding of how the climate works in that area. And it affects weather and climate in northern mid-latitudes, in North America, in Europe, and Asia, in those areas where most of the human population lives, in major ways. And therefore, it's important to get a better understanding and to improve our projections how the Arctic climate will change until the end of the century.
Now, Stefanie, what was, I suppose, challenging about this? Why was it such a big wall to break to actually stay in the Arctic for a full year?
I mean, not sure whether you have an idea how the Arctic looked like in winter, for example. I mean, this is really, as Markus just mentioned, that's an area where you are ice covered, where thick ice is, it's dark the whole time. So this is, of course, a big challenge in terms of how to work on the ice, in terms of safety, but also really in the end to how do I get my samples in those really harsh conditions in terms of weather, in terms of this isolation. Do I have everything with me that I need up there to do my research? This was already in the phase of preparation. I mean, the entire expedition took like 8 to 9 years to prepare for it, to go there for this 1 year in the ice. And this makes us, of course, a big challenge to get all these competencies together on that ship and then to work in that conditions up there for a full year to get all these thousands of samples that we brought back home.
And how many people were actually in the team working on it?
Well, on board, we've been, in terms of science, always around 50, 60 people, but we split it the whole year into, in the end, 5 different legs. But it was not only about the people on board, but we had a really big amount of people in the backyard back home in terms of logistics, in terms of satellite data, and also there was a huge group of people behind us, supporting us on site.
I guess this is a question to both of you, but how big an element is the human element when you are in quite intense, quite isolating conditions for much of the year?
It is, in general, already a really big one. And on the leg I have been on, it was then also the Corona pandemic, to be honest, because when I left for that expedition in January, this was still really far away. And then at some point, there was the Corona pandemic starting up here while we had scientific challenges in the Arctic. So in the beginning, I thought, okay, we are not touched by that at all. But of course, we became a really big part of that Corona pandemic because we couldn't go home. The entire exchange couldn't happen. And then this became a really big human challenge for several people. But in general, I think, yes, we are living there in this isolation. And I think now with the Corona pandemic, again, people know what I'm talking about. With a big difference that we are 100 people on board being together isolated compared to sitting alone at home. But of course, it's a challenge if you have family, if you have kids at home. And this is always what you have in mind when you go on expedition, because it's clear you can't go just simply back home and say bye. So therefore, it is a challenge, but you know what you're doing when you go there in normal case.
And Markus, what was your experience of, I suppose, this human dimension of?
I think an important element in that is that this was absolutely an international expedition. 20 nations had to come together to make it possible. We operated 7 icebreakers and research vessels to make it possible, and that can't be done by one country alone. And therefore, the spirit on board is a very international one. It's a team of scientists and crew members and logistical people working together, completely isolated, locked into the ice. The ship was frozen into the ice and drifting with the ice without the possibility to get free during the expedition, and no one would be able to reach us during that time. So everybody knows we rely on each other. It's an isolated team, and that really results in very close connections between people. It's a fantastic spirit on board. Everybody has impressions and pictures from the work on the ice every day and knows this is very unique to be there, and that results in a fantastic and very stimulating spirit, even during the very, very long months of complete darkness of the polar night.
You mentioned some of our knowledge of how climate change is affecting the Arctic and how the Arctic is affecting climate change. But what are the gaps in that knowledge of how the Arctic is affected by climate change that you were trying to break down?
We know from observations that the Arctic is warming rapidly, and the processes that contribute to the fact that the Arctic is warming so much faster than the rest of the planet need to be studied, because they are very unique to the Arctic. The Arctic is the only major part of our planet where you have a big, deep ocean, the Arctic Ocean, 4,000 meters deep, covered by a thin layer of ice and snow on top, separating that ocean from the extremely cold atmosphere above. The layer of ice is below 1 meter thick in the beginning. It's 2 to a maximum 3 meters at the end of winter, and then the layer of snow. And that is an isolating layer which really results in climate processes which are unique to the Arctic, the energy fluxes from the ocean through snow and ice into the atmosphere and vice versa, the metafluxes of biogeochemical species, the little eddies in the atmosphere and in the ocean that transport energy and result in an exchange of energy of that ice and snow domain with the ocean and the atmosphere. Those can't be studied from space. Those can't be studied with autonomous instrumentation. Humans need to go there and take these measurements. And we took more than 100 parameters. We measured for the full year in a very consistent way. We had 100 tons of equipment on the ice, several kilometers of arm-thick power lines. So it was a major scientific installation on the ice, and that can't be done without being there.
Stefanie, why should people, perhaps in Germany, perhaps even further south, care about what's happening in the Arctic?
Yeah, I mean, Markus talked about that already in the beginning. So the point is we can't say, okay, the Arctic, it's far away, we don't care about it. But we are really all connected via the circulation patterns in the atmosphere and in the ocean over the whole world. And in the end, we can basically say what is happening in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic because of those circulation systems. And that means, for example, I think one very, very prominent example is the jet stream that is separating in normal case those cold air masses in the north from the warmer air masses further south. And given the fact that it's now getting warmer in the Arctic, this jet stream, it starts to kind of getting unstable, and therefore warmer air masses go to the Arctic and colder air masses come to us. Meaning, for example, I mean, we had especially now in Germany in the summer this flood event in the western part. We have all those really extreme weather conditions either in summer in Germany or Northern Europe in general, or also in winter when we have those really strong winters with a lot of snow, for example, in New York. And those are all results of that change in the Arctic climate system, which is currently, or which is really like, yeah, moving towards us and therefore influencing us a lot in all or throughout the year.
Now, how much was this, I suppose, a personal breakthrough? How much did it mean to you and change your relationship with the Arctic to stay there for an entire year?
Well, I mean, I'm studying the Arctic since 10 years now, so it was like really, I kind of feel a strong relationship to the polar regions in general. But for me personally, I must admit, it was really kind of emotional, really, to stay there for a couple of months with that one ice floe. In a normal case, when we go on expeditions, it's like you are several days maybe on the one ice floe and then you go to the next one. But now staying for a couple of months with that one ice floe, and you really feel how it changes in terms of we had a lot of lead openings. So when the ice is cracking and just opening and you see again the water, the ocean, and when then all this entire system is moving together again and building up those huge ice ridges. And it was on the one hand fascinating to see the strength of the Arctic nature and of the power of nature. But on the other hand, it was really also those dynamic processes. This is also a process of the new Arctic. The old Arctic, as like tens of years ago, was not that dynamic, was not that much moving. And therefore, when you feel those cracks, when you hear how these ice ridges pile up, it's threatening, and it's like, okay, wow, this is now an Arctic that I can still experience, but I'm not sure whether the next generation will see it and feel it in that way as I can feel it and see it now. And this is really what makes me kind of emotional about being there and about seeing and feeling this Arctic nature.
Markus, did seeing these changes also change your relationship with the Arctic?
Definitely. I mean, I traveled to the Arctic since the early 90s, since pretty much exactly 30 years now, and I have seen these changes. When I came to the Arctic in the 90s, it was a different world. It was a world only with snow and ice and different conditions than we have nowadays. During the expedition in summer, we have seen the great melt of the Arctic ice. We have been very close to the North Pole in summer, but still we had huge patches of open water, completely eroded ice, rotten ice with lots of holes from melt ponds. And we could see how the Arctic ice is disappearing. If this continues, then the Arctic will become ice-free in summer in just a few decades within our lifetime. So our children would not be able to see the fascinating world we have experienced there in the Arctic. And I think we all love that ice, and we always want to go back once we are here on land. Our children may not be able to experience and see that in their lifetime, ice in summer in the Arctic. That is to some extent depressing, but it's also very motivating to get into action now to protect climate.
And is that something, I suppose, you're both involved in, is trying to not just understand the science, but to spread the science to the general public and also to policy, so that we can maybe keep the Arctic somewhat as it is today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very important element of what we have done with the expedition. It was driven by doing science and better understanding the system, but it has the potential to get many more people interested in the Arctic and educate them about the status of the Arctic ice. And they also educate them about what we need to do now. Results from the expedition in winter show that the freezing in winter is still pretty healthy, and that means the ice is probably not yet on a self-sustained way to disappear. It's still in our hands. We still have that time window to save the ice of the Arctic, even in summer. And therefore, I think we really should do everything to use that time window, and therefore we talk to many kinds of stakeholders a lot, all political levels, from the ministers and to the members of parliament, but also to the general public, because in the end, in democracies, any climate protection plan needs to be supported by a majority of our societies.
And Stefanie, do you see this as well as, I suppose, a part of your role as a researcher, to take the research beyond the academic realm?
Yes, definitely. So I also see the big point on the one hand, as Markus said, to talk about our results and what we've seen to politicians and stakeholders. But I also think that in general, as you said, that the society is a really important part of that game. And therefore, I mean, we see it with now the Fridays for Futures and Science for Futures movements, which shows us that especially the younger generation has a big interest in changing things, to change politics, to change all of our minds. And therefore, I think this connections of that the young that the young generation has now the spirit, and that we have the experience, and that we have the knowledge about the Arctic and in general the polar regions. I think bringing both together, this might be in the end the key to really change things. And I think on that perspective, we are on a good way, especially with the Mosaic expedition, because this was like really well received in the public. It was really, really well visible. And this was a really nice accomplishment also of that expedition.
We've spoken very generally about the Arctic, about the work, but I'd be really curious whether there was a particular observation or a particular method you were able to employ, or anything that really stood out from, maybe it's difficult from a whole year of work, but whether there was some particular piece of science that you feel particularly proud of or emotional about that you were able to carry out. Let's start with you, Markus.
We had a huge scientific program connecting all the disciplines which we need to understand the Arctic system. So I think what stands out most is the multidisciplinarity of the project rather than any one individual measurement. The teams from atmospheric scientists, snow and ice scientists, people working in the ocean ecosystem, people, biogeochemistry scientists, they all work together very closely, and it's the combination of all these things which will allow our breakthrough, and which is so unique about the expedition we carried out. Of course, we had cutting-edge instrumentation with us, some of which was never deployed or never used in the Arctic, and is absolutely the best in science we can do. We had instrumentation to measure in very high resolution, time and spatial resolution, the temperature structure in the boundary layer from an optical fiber with ultra-short laser pulses traveling through that fiber up and down, and the fiber was being supported by a tethered balloon. So that's absolutely unique and never has done that before. We had autonomous, remotely controlled vehicles traveling under the ice, diving robots looking at the surface of the ice from below. Extremely important measurements, and many, many more breakthroughs, I would say, also on the technological side.
Just on the interdisciplinarity, it's a word that we use a lot, especially at events like Falling Walls, but can you give a sense of how unusual and how special the level of interdisciplinarity of this voyage were?
Absolutely. I think it will have a long-standing effect on the community. It has formed one coherent Arctic science community, which was a community of separated disciplinary work before Mosaic. And I think that will remain. We will continue to work together across the disciplinary boundaries. My background is physics, atmospheric physics, actually. I know what a copepod is from our ecosystem people. It's a little creature living under the ice, and the ecosystem people now understand what an atmospheric eddy is, what its role in the climate system is. I think we have learned a lot from each other. We have learned our languages, which are a little different in these different communities, and that is one of the fantastic breakthroughs, really, from the Mosaic expedition.
And I'll just remind the audience watching that you are able to ask questions. Just raise your hand if you have anything you'd like to bring up to our guests. But while you're thinking about what you want to ask, I'll just turn back to Stefanie and ask, what stood out for you about the work you were able to do over this year?
Yeah, so of course, I agree in 100% what Markus just said. And I think for me personally, so I'm from the sea ice, I'm coming from the sea ice perspective, and my personal matter of interest is the snow on top. And the snow is a really nice example of this interdisciplinarity of the Arctic climate system, and also what we studied for Mosaic, because on the one hand, the snow is the one giving the ice its color, and therefore it's the one also being in contact with the atmosphere. Therefore, all those interactions between the atmosphere and the sea ice is driven by the snow. On the other hand, the snow is really, in the end, the component deriving how much the sea ice can grow because of its isolation on top. And we have also a lot of processes and fluxes within the snow, which were then of interest for the biogeochemical working group and all that. And that was really interesting to see. In normal case, when I was before in the field, just with my sea ice physics group, so to say, I have my snow and just look at from like the physical point of view. But now seeing how many other people are interested in snow in so many different ways, this was really interesting and really inspiring also for future work, for future joint projects and proposals that will come up.
Now, of course, there are communities, not across the world, but in northern latitudes who have a very personal, very intimate relationship and a very historical relationship with the Arctic. Does your work or your communication interact with these communities in any way?
Yes, it does. And yes, these communities, it's their home, the indigenous population of the Arctic, and they are affected every single day by the climate change that has already occurred. I've been talking to people from the Inuit community in northern Baffin Island, and it's dramatic how much their life has changed during their lifetime. They live in small villages along the coastlines of the fjords, and they used to form a community and could visit each other regularly by traveling across the sea ice with dog sleds or with snowmobiles. But the sea ice goes away, and that's their traffic route. So they fall apart. They get separated, these little communities. They are no longer able to visit each other or to organize themselves, and that makes their weak voice even weaker. They are affected most by climate change, but their voice is hardly ever heard.
Now, what's next for these kinds of expeditions? I don't know, staying for 2 years, 3 years, or is it repeating this kind of voyage with different observations?
Well, I mean, originally I'm working in the Antarctic, so in the southern hemisphere, and therefore, of course, my personal wish would be to do something comparable also in the south, because I mean, we have all these changes that we observe in the northern and northern hemisphere, also especially related to the Arctic sea ice extent. And this is what we do not observe so far, or in that strength in the Antarctic. Therefore, we would have there now the possibility to kind of really study the system in detail at a point of time where we don't have that many changes, and then to see how it might change at some point, because not of course, but most likely we will also reach that point in the Southern Ocean, because there we have, of course, a lot of other components also adding to this entire system, because we have the big Antarctic continent with its land ice masses in the back. So therefore, there are completely different processes and properties to study in the end. And this would be, of course, really interesting also to use now all our expertise that we got from the Arctic, that we just really gained through the Mosaic expedition, to bring it also southwards and to also study there the system. But of course, also for the Arctic, I mean, the change is ongoing, and there are, of course, a lot of expeditions, not that long, but like our normal Polarstern expeditions coming up to continue those measurements, to continue all our time series, to see how do all these different processes and properties continue.
Maybe I can add to this. Mosaic started as a dream more than 10 years before we carried out the expedition. And we have a number of big things which are in the dream stage right now. Not I guess not all of these dreams will see the light of day, but some of them may turn into something which we can then carry out in the time frame of between 5 and 10 years from now. The big things coming up, and as Stefanie just mentioned, it's an ongoing research with Blastern commuting between both hemispheres, doing the standard expeditions. But we'll again focus on the big science, focus on the big questions which we really need to answer to make progress in understanding the system, in providing the robust scientific basis for the decisions our societies have to take these days. And these decisions are so important. They will affect so many aspects of how we live that we need the best scientific basis for these decisions possible. And we are dreaming about big things in the future to even improve that.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for joining us. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Markus Rex and Stefanie Arndt, for joining us. We now will take a short break, but we'll be back in around 5 minutes for our next interview. So stick around on Zoom so you don't miss that. It will be with our next guest, David Stark.